a sunny afternoon when you'd probably rather be outside. But hopefully it's going to be an interesting topic of conversation.
Jamie, can you speak up a bit?
Yeah, can you hear me now okay?
That's better.
Is that better? Okay, I'll try
Yeah,
to get the
that's
mic
better, yeah.
try and get the mic a little bit closer to me. How's that now?
That's good.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
So to introduce myself, by career, I guess I'm a management consultant, but that's not particularly relevant for what I'm doing today. I spent most of my time at the moment on a portfolio of different NGO and charity campaigning projects and developing this idea of sentientism and raising awareness of it is I guess a bit of a personal mission for me at the moment. So it's great to be here to talk to you about it. As an audience of humanists, a lot of this content will feel familiar to you, but hopefully it will also stretch some of our thinking as we go through the conversation as well. And it's probably best to start off with a definition of what sentientism is, what sort of thing it is. And in that sense, it's very much like humanism. It's a worldview or a philosophy, a way of thinking about what is true and what we should care about ethically. And in 3 words, I'd summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion. So hence the title you can see in front of you there. Again, that will resonate very strongly with most people's conception, at least of a modern secular humanism. So the core elements of it are a commitment to evidence, evidence of reality. I guess you might think of that as a naturalistic stance that rejects the supernatural, like humanism does, and looks for a scientific worldview or a worldview based on using evidence and reason as the only grounded way of accurately, albeit imperfectly, understanding the world. So there's that commitment to evidence and reason, which is exactly the same as that of secular humanism. The second question sentientism asks and answers is, okay, if that's how we understand reality and how we choose what to believe in, what should we care about morally? What's meaningful morally? And the answer sentientism gives is that we should have moral consideration for all sentient beings. So, their experience of suffering and flourishing matters morally. There's no type of suffering or there's no type of subjective experience that we should exclude when we're thinking about what things are morally good or bad. So that's it in very, very simple terms. So how you might come to that personally, starting from scratch, if you like, is laid out on the right-hand side. So each of us experiences sentience, and the simplest definition of sentience is the ability or capacity for subjective experience, the ability to experience anything at all. So on the negative side, that might be suffering. That could be anything from basic pain through to existential angst and sorrow, or on the positive side, that could be anything, any type of flourishing. So that could be basic physical pains all the way through to love or a sense of a worthwhile contribution or a sense of meaning. So we all experience that we are sentient as individuals. Now, I'm pretty confident that each of the people on this call are sentient as well. I don't know. I don't have 100% proof of that. But based on observing you, based on experience, based on the fact that our anatomies are pretty similar, I'm pretty confident that that the other people on this call are sentient. And I can apply that very simply to the rest of the human race. But actually, when you study the biology of non-human animals, you can understand a good level of confidence that many other types of being are sentient as well. So I personally experience suffering as bad and flourishing as good. That's almost definitional. We don't like pain, we do like pleasure. So I can also reason based on that biological evidence and by anatomical evidence and by experience of behavior that other sentient beings also don't like suffering and do like flourishing. Again, almost tautological, seems pretty straightforward. So on that basis, if morality, and obviously morality is a massively complex area of study that philosophers and lay people like me have argued over for millennia, but at its base, morality is about determining good or bad actions. And the main way we assess whether something is morally good or bad is really ultimately based on their outcomes, is based on the degree to which they cause suffering or flourishing. And while there are some moral systems that have different types of judgment, when you drill down and drill down, it's quite hard to find a moral justification for something or a moral judgment that doesn't ultimately come down to the experience of a sentient being, something feeling good or feeling bad, or experiencing something or feeling something that's good or bad. So if we follow that flow through, we can conclude, and this may seem obvious to some, that it's moral to avoid causing suffering, and it's and to try and encourage flourishing for all beings that are capable of experience. And in a way, that's the moralistic side of sentientism, if you like, is that we should, using a scientific worldview based on evidence and reason, come to understand what beings are sentient, what beings are capable of suffering and flourishing. We should care about all of those beings, and we should care about all of the suffering and flourishing that's caused to them, and we should use that as a basis for our morality. So if you like, that's a sort of simple definition of sentientism as a commitment to evidence and reason and compassion for all sentient beings. And if you like, a personal journey of how you might get to that conclusion from, I guess, initially personal experience of sentience, but then a scientific understanding of the implication that other beings are sentient as well. So hopefully that makes sense as a definition of what sentientism is. And you might have a sense that, you know, that's maybe a 75-80% overlap with humanism, or even a higher proportion as well. So what it might be useful to do is to set out in that context, where did sentientism come from, if you want to draw almost a evolutionary tree of different isms or different worldviews. The top half of this diagram, if you can see it okay, answers that first question, what to believe in. And it lays out two primary, or, you know, the foundation of naturalism, which is the rejection of the supernatural, the belief that everything in the universe is essentially some form of matter or energy, including dark matter and energy, or patterns of information processing within those physical things. So there's nothing beyond the natural, if you like. So I guess that's a foundation that, again, sentientism shares with modern secular humanism. Now, one of the implications of naturalism is atheism, in that if a naturalist is only willing to believe things based on well-grounded evidence and reason, and can't find any good evidence for deity, that might naturally lead you to atheism. Obviously, another strong thread with modern secular humanism as well. But atheism and naturalism themselves don't tell you much about morality. It's really just a stance of what do you believe is real. It doesn't necessarily say much about what do you care about in and of itself. And that's the rest of the diagram. The rest of the diagram is setting out different schools of thought about what should we care about. So if you follow the central flow through, and this is really also my own personal journey, starting from a naturalism and an atheism, and then thinking, okay, atheism doesn't say much about morality, so what is a good grounding for our morality? One place that may well lead you, and has probably led many of you, is to humanism, where you say, have a naturalistic stance. We reject supernatural views about what's real, but we also reject supernatural views about what is moral and what isn't moral. So we're going to extend our circle of compassion, again, based on evidence and reason, to all humans. We're going to essentially grant equal moral consideration to all humans, and we will judge morality and ethics based on the impact that actions and decisions have on all humans. So that would take you to humanism. What sentientism then does is it really takes in some feeds from the left and the right hand side of this diagram, which complement that humanistic view, centers on humans. So on the left hand, can everyone hear me okay still?
Yeah.
Yep. So on the left hand side, there's a field of, I guess, animal ethics or animal related philosophy, which was thinking from a slightly different stance of, shouldn't we extend our moral circle further than just humans? And it does that, again, on a basis of evidence and reason, in that it says that humans ultimately are animals. We're part of an evolutionary tree. And again, the more we understand about animals, the more we understand they're also capable of suffering. Maybe they require some form of rights, they require some form of dignity. And you can see very early thinkers, even in the 1700s, like Bentham, saying, it doesn't matter if a being can talk or even if it can think, it's a question of whether it can suffer or not. And that developed through a more modern animal ethics movement, driven by people like Richard Ryder and Peter Singer. You can see that. You may have heard of Peter Singer's name. He's very well known as a practical ethicist in a broader context as well, which tried to bring a more specific stance to, okay, which animals should we really care about? And there's a term there called sentiocentrism, which is very similar to sentientism, which says it is that ability to suffer, that ability to experience things subjectively, that should determine which of these animals or which types of being we should grant moral consideration to. So some people might grant moral consideration to a companion or a pet animal, but not to farm animals. Others might be interested in granting moral consideration to charismatic wildlife, but not to vermin or some other types of animals. And what sentiocentrism does, it says, no, we need to be scientific about this. We should draw the boundary of our moral concern based on which of these animals have the capability to suffer. So that's really what sentiocentrism does. And sentientism takes that line of thinking and adds it to the naturalism of humanism to create sentientism, if that makes sense. So it's bringing in the animal ethics thinking as well as the modern secular humanist thinking and layers in sentientism. So then we start to get a little weirder. And this angle annoys many of the people like me who call themselves sentientists, because their priority and my priority is around sentient beings that exist today, humans and non-human animals that exist in their billions on this planet. Whereas the things on the right-hand side don't exist, or at least if they do exist, we have no contact with them. But at least conceptually, there are other areas of thinking that came even out of sci-fi, but now are live in the quite active topical fields of artificial intelligence ethics and robot rights, which are thinking, okay, if we're granting moral consideration based on sentience, and if we have a naturalistic and a scientific worldview that sees sentience and consciousness really as just another class of information processing that happens to go on in our neurons and our neurological systems in our brains, is there any principled reason why you couldn't imagine some other form of substrate, a computer or some form of alien intelligence that couldn't also have sentience? And although we don't, I don't believe they exist today and we don't have any interaction with them, at least in concept, if you want to have a future-proof philosophy, would it make sense to be open-minded, at least, that if we do come across or create some other form of being that has sentient capacity, wouldn't we grant them moral consideration as well? So that fills out, I guess, these three elements of sentientist history: the naturalist humanist theme that takes naturalism and layers in humanist morals and ethics; the animal ethics, which says, look, why should we just draw a moral circle around humans? Let's extend that to other animals that are able to suffer; and then the slightly weirder, sci-fi artificial intelligence theme on the right, which is, at least in concept, if there are other types of things that are capable of sentience, wouldn't we want to grant them moral consideration too? So hopefully that gives you a sense of, if you like, the philosophical history of sentientism and where it came from. I'm very happy to take questions as we go through as well. I don't want to keep charging ahead if I'm saying anything confusing.
Yes, please do ask questions if you want to.
Okay, to keep going for the moment?
Yep.
So this is the last one was a sort of historic genealogy, if you like, of sentientism. This one is really trying to explain how sentientism differs from some of the other isms that you might find in the moral philosophy sphere. And some of them we've touched on already. We've talked about humanism being focused largely on humans, and sentientism adding in other types of sentient being to that sphere of moral consideration. There are also on the left schools of thought that say sentientism might not even go far enough. Maybe we need a biocentrism that cares morally about everything that's living, so including plants or non-sentient animals, or even to ecocentrism, which says we shouldn't just care morally about things that are alive, we should care about the entire of the environment. So some of these schools of thought suggest that sentientism doesn't go far enough in extending its moral consideration. We talked already about sentiocentrism, which is very similar in that it says we should grant moral consideration for everything that has sentience. But sentientism is different because it includes the humanistic and the naturalistic commitment to evidence and reason, whereas many religious people are sentiocentrist for supernatural or religious reasons as well. So there's a distinction that we draw between sentientism and sentiocentrism. There's an active movement within the animal ethics sphere that focuses on anti-speciesism, which is rejecting us judging morally or grading morally based on different species. And their primary focus is on resisting the human tendency to privilege humans over all other animals, but it could arguably also challenge the way we categorize certain different animals. We care about pets and companion animals, but not about farmed animals. So anti-speciesism is resisting the use of species as a distinction. Again, it has something in common with sentientism, because sentientism does the same thing, but in rejecting species as a distinction, it instead says we should focus on sentience, which can correlate with species, but in a very different way. There are some interesting movements that some of you may have heard about around post-humanism or transhumanism, which, if you like, they have the sort of future thinking side of sentientism, and they're thinking in unconstrained ways about where humankind might get to and new forms of sentience and how we might use bioengineering or drugs or technologies to extend human lifespans and to enhance the quality of human sentient experience. But many transhumanists, again, while they're focused on the quality of sentient experiences, often forget the many other types of sentience that exist on the planet today and are very focused on where humans are going to go in the future. So again, that's a significant difference. There are some overlaps in the style of thinking, but there are some big differences there. Another few isms you might think of, one obvious one is veganism. Now, veganism is, I would argue, a natural implication of sentientism, because if you have moral consideration for all sentient beings, you'd have to find a very strong justification for having them harmed and killed for us to eat. But there are, again, some differences. So many vegans are vegan for religious or supernatural reasons, whereas most sentientists are vegan for purely scientific and reasons based on evidence and reason. And there are also some differences around the margin as well, in that veganism and vegetarianism use the definition of the word animal to draw their moral circle, which is fairly similar to sentience, but it's not the same, in that there are some very simple types of animals that clearly aren't sentient. So sea cucumbers, for example, are classed as animals but have no nervous system whatsoever. So whereas a strict vegan, although I'm not sure sea cucumbers are great to eat anyway, a strict vegan might include a sea cucumber as an animal in their sphere of moral concern. A sentientist might not, because we focus on the things that are capable of suffering, not just a biological classification. So hopefully that's laid out some of the differences and the clarifications between some of the other isms on that page. Most of them have some overlap with sentientism, but they also have some quite clear difference too. Any questions on the isms? I was also very nervous about adding another ism, but we have too many, if you like. But hopefully this is a useful one.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, you're on. Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely.
As a humanist, everything you have said, it includes me, whether it is biological, ecological, animal ethics, everything. I don't think I go around disrespecting my environment simply because I don't feel it is a sentient being. I think everything is extremely important. But of course, the conflict of interest arises when you consider whether it is an animal you want to eat or an animal which has attack the society because we have gone and taken over its environment.
Mm.
And what do you do with it then? That would be the moral dilemma. But otherwise, I think everything you have said, I believe as a humanist, most probably most of us, that is what we support.
Yeah,
so
it's good.
how do you think one could deal with conflict of interest? And where does that fit in? Do humans get the upper hand then?
So it's good to hear, and I hear that from many humanists. They say, well, I agree with all of this. So in a way, they're a sentientist already as well as a humanist, and I consider myself both. If I start with the environmental question, the sentientist position is very concerned about the environment as a whole, as a network, as a sort of layer of complex interdependencies, as a sort of rich set of ecosystems. So the difference is may seem trivial, but it can be important in that the reason sentientists see the environment as deeply important is because of its effect on sentient beings. So the reason we care about air pollution isn't because the air doesn't like being dirty, it's because of what it does to the experience of sentient beings. The reason we might be worried about species diversity is because we're not interested in the species themselves, but because of the suffering of the individual beings or the knock-on implications of that lack of diversity might have for sentient beings. So in most cases, people who have a sentientist or indeed a humanist stance, they grant deep importance to many aspects of the environment that aren't human and aren't sentient, but rather than it being intrinsic moral worth, if that makes sense, we're granting them instrumental moral worth. We see them as important because they're so critical to sentient beings or to humans. So hopefully that clarifies the distinction between the sort of ecocentrism and a sentientist or a humanist stance. And it can be important because there are some edge cases where you will see someone who is an ardent environmentalist arguing morally to defend a river or a mountain or something that isn't sentient, even though it clearly harms many sentient beings in awful ways. So you will find environmentalists who seem to be deeply concerned about humans, deeply concerned about the environment, but have actually skipped over the concern for the sentient beings that exist in the environment with us. And you can see that in that there are active movements to grant rights to rivers and mountains that seem to be making more progress than some of the movements to grant rights to animals. So there are some, I think in most cases, we share an environmentalist agenda, but there are edge cases where the priorities, I think, do get thrown off, and you can see environmentalists driving for things which I would see as, morally negative. The other part of your question about trade-offs, in a way, sentientism, like humanism, doesn't present us a perfect argument. Sentientism is deliberately very, very basic. It's just a commitment to naturalism, and it's just a commitment to who we include in our moral consideration, which beings we include. It leaves open a whole world of complexity about how to handle trade-offs, conflicts of interest, and prioritization. So in a way, sentientism as a philosophy sort of cops out of much of that complexity. But there's a very wide variety and diversity of views within sentientism about how to address those different schools of thought. So some sentientists argue that all sentient beings should be accorded equal moral consideration, even if the nature of their sentience and their experiences is different. They say, who are we to judge the experience of a chicken against the experience of a human? They should all have equal moral consideration. So some sentientists would think that way. Most, including me, disagree with that stance and say that science shows us that there's an enormous variety of sentient experiences, and that it's likely that some types of non-human animal will have a more simplistic range of sentient experiences than us. So it might make sense to grade moral consideration slightly differently. So, I'm rushing towards a burning building and can only save the chicken or the human. It's clear that I'll save the human. Part of that will be an emotional response. Part of that, in the thought experiment would be because I would grant higher moral consideration to the human than to the chicken. But what's common to all sentientists is that we grant at least a meaningful baseline moral consideration to every sentient being, even the simpler ones. And if you grant a meaningful moral consideration to a sentient being, that means you need some overwhelmingly strong moral reason to cause it harm or to cause it suffering. Sometimes that can be justified, as it is with humans, right? Sometimes it's the right thing morally to kill a human, but you wouldn't be able to justify that morally with some sort of trivial excuse when you had other options, if that makes sense. So there is a strong baseline there. And what we often find is that one challenge to sentientism is that people will say, look, we need to prioritize humans, and when we've fixed all of the discrimination and the problems in the human sphere, then we can come on to thinking more broadly about a moral circle that includes sentient animals as well. And I resist that, partly because I think those other sentient creatures, we farm and kill well over 100 billion land animals every year. I mean, the sheer scale of it is mind-blowing. So that is a priority in its own life, in its own right. But what you also find is that as you extend our moral circle within humanity and even beyond, that tends to benefit the people who were already in the moral circle. So one of the things you'll find as you think about what we might do differently with animal farming is when you think about the environmental challenges of animal farming, when you think about zoonotic diseases, when you think about antimicrobial resistance, and when you think about the sheer economic inefficiency of feeding plants through animals before you eat them and losing 95% of the calories in the nutrition, actually many of the actions you would take as a sentientist directly have benefits to humans as well. So often there's a win-win situation there, really, rather than a trade-off. But as you say, Iran, there are situations where there are genuine trade-offs, and many difficult philosophical challenges remain. But hopefully that gives you a sense of how a sentientist might approach it.
Yes, and also in animal research, I mean, sometimes in medical research you have no choice but to use an animal. But obviously you have to deal with that ethically, and you have to justify that use. In the same way that I suppose if people want to eat cows and sheep and whatever, it has to be justified on certain levels. And I don't think, as far as domestic animals come into consideration, it will be a very, very long time for people to turn away from that, because that is very much a way of life, and also it supports, you pointed out all the negative aspects of farming, but also it has got a lot of positive aspects, which obviously people use it in support of their arguments. However, carry on. Thank you very much for responding.
Thank you. And you mentioned the animal research topic. Again, that's a challenging one, because you can imagine an ethical argument where carrying out harmful experiments on a sentient animal and even humans could be morally justified if you can see an overwhelming positive outcome as a result of that you couldn't have achieved elsewhere. But what I would suggest is that by starting from a sentientist viewpoint, you're more likely to find equally viable alternatives, whereas too often, given our cultural baggage and because of our strange ability to completely ignore the moral salience of non-human sentient animals, we tend to default to solutions that cause harm without really examining them. But I agree, there are absolutely situations where it is still moral to cause harm or even death.
Yeah, Terry, you have a question, I think.
Yeah,
I do really. It's more of a comment, really. I think that environmentalism, in actually protecting the planet, which is our life support system for all forms of life, you achieve the result of sentientism anyway, because it's going to take a very long time to turn the ship around and have a more ecologically balanced planet. But in my point again, to make it again, is that if you look after the planet, you look after all sentient beings on the planet, and that is the first priority.
I agree. I think there's enormous overlap in the agenda. Yeah. And that's the right way of doing it. The only thing that makes me hesitate is that there are many environmentalists today that they are more concerned about a population or a habitat or a species or diversity. They're more worried about concepts than they are about the suffering of individuals. And sometimes we'll put forward policies that cause wide scale suffering and death to many, many, many sentient beings for some, defense of an environmentalist concept. But I agree. I think generally an environmentalist agenda ties up very closely with the sentientist agenda, because ultimately the only reason morally why we want to defend the environment is because it's good for us and it's good for everything else that can experience it. That's the whole point. Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can imagine a distant planet that will never be seen or experienced by any sentient being whatsoever. To my mind, until it is seen, until it's experienced, until it's lived in, it's morally neutral. I mean, it's morally meaningless. There's nothing there to experience it. There's a thought experiment. But I agree, in practical terms, there's massive overlap in the agendas. Okay. Let me move on. So I'm not going to draw you through this, but what this tries to lay out is some differences between some of those different worldviews when thinking about which types of being or entity warrant moral consideration. And what it's probably worth zeroing in on here, because I want to be fair to humanism as a movement, and I've been a member of Humanists UK for many years, and I still count myself as a humanist, is that despite the name humanist, both international humanist organisations and Humanists UK have actually updated their definitions of humanism in recent years to include some consideration for other forms of sentient animals as well. So there is already a shift within humanism as a movement to think about extending the moral circle a little bit further to include sentient animals. So you could argue, well, in that case, what's the point of sentientism? Isn't it redundant? And I guess the challenge, or my response to that, is that many humanists, I would argue even most humanists, aren't necessarily aware of that change of definition or the extension of definitions. That in many cases it does come across as a little bit of an afterthought. And you can see that both in the content and the output of humanist organisations, and indeed in their campaigns and their policies and the stances of most humanist leaders. Almost all of the content and the campaigns and the output focus on the human agenda and focus on resisting religious privilege and many other causes, which I fully and wholeheartedly support. I think they're deeply important in the modern day and age, particularly when we can consider the global situation. But there's almost nothing that focuses on any type of being that isn't human. And you might argue that that's a fair focus for humanist organizations, and it makes sense to target campaigns and to not duplicate the efforts of others, and that's entirely fine. But it does show that the vast bulk of the humanist agenda is focused on the human species, as as in the name. So I do think that sentientism is a useful challenge, an extension, maybe, if you like, to the humanist agenda to say, look, we do need to actually get explicit and serious about the moral consideration of sentient non-human animals, and you have to therefore have some form of policy or stance, particularly around topics like animal farming. You couldn't imagine a situation where you were talking about humanist ethics, but at the same time remaining silent on some form of practice that caused the wide-scale harming and killing of a subset of humans. So if you are going to be serious about non-human sentient animals, you can't remain silent on a practice that, if you include fish, kills probably 2 to 3 trillion sentient creatures every year, purely for for taste and cultural and societal norms. So that's partly why I'm framing sentientism at least as a a corrective and a challenge to humanism. So I'm hoping that people who are humanists will be open-minded about extending their moral concern that extra step. And it also makes sentientism interesting for people who come out from the outside the humanist movement. They're invested in animal ethics and animal advocacy, but are frustrated by the anthropocentrism, the human focus of humanism as a movement, so have resisted moving into it. And I'm also hoping that it helps people who are involved in those movements jettison some of the woo and the supernatural thinking and some of the religious thinking. I think undermines some of the environmental and some of the animal advocacy movements, and that they join us as humanists in having a set of beliefs that are grounded in reality, because ultimately I think that will help their campaigns too. So hopefully those who are already invested in animal ethics and advocacy will add in the evidence and reason and the naturalistic humanistic way of thinking, and hopefully those who are already humanists and atheists and free thinkers and skeptics will be persuaded to extend their moral consideration that little bit further, and maybe some new people will come to the movement too. Now we're running a little short on time, but so what I might do now is just flick through some of the rest of the content to give you some time for questions. I've laid out some of the classic arguments against sentientism here, which you can imagine. Some of them are about the is-ought distinction, the sort of classic Hume response. You can't get an ought from a scientific is. Some of them are our classic rejections of atheism and humanism, which many of you will be familiar with as well. Some of them explicitly reject some of the animal ethics side and say, look, we should just focus on humans. But I'm not going to drag you through those. You can probably imagine some of the arguments, and you've probably got some in your own minds as well. This next page talks about some of the practical implications. So sometimes humanism and sentientism might seem sort of esoteric, otherworldly philosophies, but as we know, the real point here is to make a change to the world. And when you read through this list of things that might disappear in a sentientist world, again, 80% of them would disappear if everyone was a humanist as well. Anything which is harms motivated by supernatural thinking or purely traditional religious thinking, discriminations that are unfounded, racism, ageism, sexism, you'll be familiar with all of the things that humanism is also fighting against and trying to resist with a universal, liberal compassion. And sentientism shares all of those aims, but it just adds in a series of actions that focus on other types of sentient being, as you might expect. So if you like the full campaign priority of a humanist organization, we'd literally layer in a chunk that focuses on non-human and sentient animals and how would we help respond. So as with humanism, there's a whole range of practical things that sentientists can do, whether they're individual, corporate, NGO, or institutional and government changes that we might campaign to work on. Some other thoughts about practical implications, which again I'll send around later, but if you look at all of the major pieces of global governance and progress, so for example the Sustainable Development Goals, and you look at those with a new eye and you say, how would we rewrite this if we considered non-human sentient animals as well? You can come up with some very interesting implications that not only help non-human sentient animals, but also, I think, accelerate the progress of the SDGs for humans as well, particularly around some of the negative implications of animal farming that I've talked about before. But again, I'll send these around so you can sort of dig through and challenge them offline. And another classic milestone in humanist progress, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But again, it's an interesting thought experiment to say, what would we really need to do to that declaration if we wanted to broaden those rights out for other sentient beings as well, primarily non-human animals? And interestingly, as I went through, and I've actually had to go, redrafting it, which you can see on the website, there's a phenomenal amount of overlap because many non-human animals have overlapping needs with human animals as well. We all want security, we want safety, we want liberty, we want freedom from torture and freedom from slavery and the ability to live a life. As you get through to some of the higher order rights, of course, you need differentiation there, right? I mean, what does it mean to have the right to be educated if you're a pig or a cow. But so you do need some differentiation later on. But a surprising range of the rights architecture that we apply to humans would also apply, interestingly, to other types of sentient being as well. But again, I won't draw you through all of that. So rather amateurishly, what I've been trying to do is to build a little bit of a movement around the idea. And if you can imagine theoretically how many people already hold these types of views, if you look at how many atheists there are in the world, and the statistics are pretty dubious, but it does seem like maybe there's around 10% of people on the planet who are atheist or have views that are secular humanist in a way. There's probably a similar number who are ethical vegetarians or vegans, although many of them are so because of supernatural or religious reasons. But that could imply there are millions of people already around the planet who hold these views, commitment to evidence, reason, and some meaningful moral consideration for all sentient beings. And when you look out in the public media, you will find a surprising range of people who combine both a humanist commitment to evidence and reason, but a serious commitment to, as a shorthand, animal ethics as well. So whether you look at people like Ricky Gervais and Stephen Fry, you can see some of the other lists there. Many of these people probably aren't even aware of the term sentientist yet, but they have that combination of a committed humanism and a very serious stance on animal ethics that they carry through into their personal lives. So we've been building up a range of different online fora, and any of you are very welcome to join these, really just to help develop the concept, round it out a little bit. We've been producing video content and podcast content and had some articles published on it as well, but also just to build some communities of people who've either come to the subject fresh or come to it through humanism, or come to it through animal advocacy, or in some cases have come to it through artificial intelligence ethics to share and discuss ideas. And so far it's been a fascinating group of people that have come together. We have people from, I think, 75 different countries so far in the main public Facebook group, from every continent and every possible demographic. It's a breathtakingly diverse range of people, and all they share is this common single baseline. But yeah, all of those groups are open not just to people who call themselves sentientists, but to anyone who's interested in the topic. So again, I'll send this around and the links are there, and if anyone wants to join and come and chat to us, that would be great. Some of the Sentientists you can see here, we've set up a wall on our sentientism.info website where people are just coming in and adding personal messages and saying why they're a sentientist. And you can see some famous people there as well. There's David Pearce, as a philosopher, Peter Singer. You can see the co-founder of Free Thought Uganda. But most of them are just interested lay people like me who've done some reading, done some learning, joined some of the groups, and have just added some personal messages there about why sentientism resonates with them. And I've left you with some sort of further reading and some additional thoughts here at the back end as well that might be useful if people want to dig a little deeper. There isn't much writing about sentientism as a topic, but if you like, the ingredients of sentientism have long, deep roots in every region, going back centuries. So if you stitch together some of these lines of thinking, whether it's humanist, atheist, secularism, free thinking, and animal advocacy, and thinking about sentience as a grounding for morality, there's some rich veins to mine, and we're just trying to bring it together and simplify it. So I'll probably leave it there and stop banging on and just let people ask questions or chip in with some thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, Jamie. Some of this material will be available to you afterwards as well, so you can follow up on your reading, research, or activity. Does anybody have a question straight away that they'd like to ask Julie?
On one of your slides, you had painism, which doesn't include the flourishing aspect of the sentientism, as I understand it.
Yeah.
But seems like quite an attractive concept, because the problem with the flourishing is that you can't have all the species flourishing, really, because there's competition for enlargement of species between, nature being red in tooth and claw and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I thought painism actually sounded like quite an attractive thing, that you basically wouldn't want to cause any human or animal suffering, but you're not going to actually support them necessarily to flourish as a species.
Yeah, and he so that painism was developed by Richard Ryder, who was one of the first people who developed sentientism in the first place. And the reason he developed painism was partly because he thought that reducing suffering was more important than enhancing flourishing, just objectively. But it was also because he was trying to resist some quite hard-edged utilitarians who were implying you might take the flourishing of a small amount of flourishing of a large number of beings and use it to justify causing pain to something else. So the classic thought experiment is, if you go back to Roman times and you put people to fight in an amphitheater, it causes awful suffering to the two people in the amphitheater. But if the 100,000 people watching get pleasure from that, is it a morally right thing to do? So he was partly trying to resist that sort of calculation by saying, look, no, we should just focus on the pain side and the suffering side. And I think you'd find that with most sentientists, most of them would prioritize reduction of suffering over enhancing flourishing. And they would resist simplistic attempts to sort of cancel them out or justify one with the other. I think most people would think that way. But at the same time, they would still see some moral value in flourishing. So that if you had a universe of, everybody in a completely neutral state, making people happier is still a moral positive. So I think that's why some people, they like the focus on suffering as a priority, but they don't want to go as far as painism and say flourishing doesn't matter at all. But you also touch on a fascinating area, which is wild animal suffering. So most of and it's a difficult space, right? In a way, animal farming morally is a very easy topic, right? It's, frankly, to my mind, it's completely unjustifiable and should just be transitioned out of and shut down. But when you talk about wild animal suffering, there's a whole world of complexity there. What are we supposed to do with a lion who needs to eat an antelope? How can we cope with that? And it's a much less mature field of thought. And some people in the animal advocacy movement almost refuse to think about it because it's too difficult, which I think is a shame. Because there are people starting to think about the ethics of wild animal suffering and thinking about whether or not we have a moral duty to even intervene in some way in the wild to try and mitigate some of that suffering. Now, whether you could completely get rid of all suffering or how you could solve that, I don't know, but there are people thinking about different ways of at least bearing in mind the morality of wild animal suffering too. But it's a whole different world of research, Julie. But yeah, interesting topic.
Thanks.
I mean, there is also a focus on suffering in religious thought, in philosophy.
Yeah.
Which is maybe an interesting thing for a sentientist to think about as well. Is there value in suffering, in the sense that could there be ultimately flourishing through suffering, that kind of thing? Can you define these categories discretely, or do they play a part in a larger network of an individual's life or a community? Or
I agree, and I think it's important not to be too simplistic here, because it can sometimes sound like we're talking about using a spreadsheet to add up simple pains and pleasures, and that's all we're thinking about. And there are some sort of hedonistic thinkers who can sound a little bit like that, because they're, all pain is good, all pain is bad, all pleasure is good, and there's no complexity. Of course, there's an enormous richness of possible sentient experience here. So that's partly why I try and use the terms suffering and flourishing as being the broadest possible definition of, suffering is any qualitatively negative experience, and flourishing is any positively qualitative negative experience.
Yeah.
So that could involve, if you're going to the gym and you're training hard and you're suffering, but you get an enormous sense of well-being from that and fitness from that, that can be a great thing to do, right? It doesn't mean that you look at the pain while you're on the treadmill and say, this is an immoral thing to do to myself. You can still think in a richer way about some types of suffering being justified more broadly. But of course, where a religious person might say, get to the point where suffering in itself is almost seen as a good thing, like
Yeah.
the glory of sacrifice, which I see as
Yes, that's
deeply
right.
immoral.
Yes.
You know, a sentientist would never go there. A sentientist would say, okay, explain to me the positive benefits in the real world that justify the suffering that we're seeing here.
Yeah. I wonder if that leads on to another thing, which is the individual versus the group. When we're talking about experience of flourishing or suffering, we are really talking about individual units of life, or whatever you can call it. Individuals, aren't we? Which is a theme that runs through humanism, of course. Individual human rights, for example. We don't have rights for groups in the UN Declaration, anyway, or in any humanist declarations of rights. But I don't know if you've gone into thinking about what an individual, there might be other sorts of sentientism beyond the individual, for example.
I mean, sentientism, you're right, shares that focus on the individual. And I think that's pretty solidly grounded. Where sentientists differ is how to aggregate and how to add up. So, 5 people suffering is worse than 3 people suffering. But I think most sentientists would still be cautious about adding up pros and cons in an oversimplistic way. But more is still, better or worse than less. Where sentientism is deliberately and quite determinedly focused on the individual. Another example is when we're talking about the environmentalist challenge we talked about before. Some people will, for example, will advocate killing sentient creatures for the good of the species of which they are a part. And to a sentientist, that doesn't really make sense, because the species can't experience anything. That group doesn't experience. It's the individuals that experience. So there still may be a justification because of the health of those individuals that you might want to intervene. But the idea of, killing thousands or millions of a particular creature, for the health of the species, it doesn't make sense to a sentientist in the same way as, that logic wouldn't work for a human group.
Yes. That may have political implications to that, because there's a lot of group identity politics around at the moment.
Yeah.
I don't know, politics plays into sentientism too, into sentientist thought.
Well, it does. And I think, again, when it comes to humans, I think sentientism plays a very similar role to humanism, in that I think, humanism and sentientism both look at different types of humans and different groups of humans. And we almost revel in the diversity and the different viewpoints and the different stances and the different histories and the different ways of thinking. But, and we use those differences and understanding of them sometimes to diagnose problems and to spot where there's discrimination or where there are issues to a group that impact on the individuals we care about. But when we're thinking about solutions, I think sentientism is very similar to humanism, in that our common appeal is to a universal liberal humanism, and what we all have in common that we can work on together, as that being the solution, rather than focusing on the things that divide us as the solution, if that makes sense. So I think humanism and sentientism, both share a sort of common stance on some of those modern identity politics, in trying to revel in the diversity, but also focus on what we have in common and use that to bring us forward. And for humanism, that's our common humanity. And for sentientism, that's our common sentience. So, we also have arms of politics that are pretty fiery at the moment around, for example, how vegan and animal ethics groups are coping with Black Lives Matter and coping with some of the obvious imperatives in human rights. So there are some groups which are saying, no, we're just here to focus on the animals. Let's leave the human topics out of it. And others who are saying, well, no, but humans are animals, and humans are sentient too. We should have a broader moral compassion for the problems that affect human animals as well as non-human animals. Let's have a more holistic approach. And sentientism plays, again, into that latter approach. It doesn't say different forms of oppression are the same. It doesn't say our experiences are the same, but it does say we all have a common capacity for subjective experience, sentience, that is a moral grounding for us all, that we should all work on together to try and help each other.
Mm.
And personally, I find that sort of positive, progressive stance ultimately, more inspirational than some of the other approaches people are taking.
Yes. I find it does, well, at least taking a humanist point of view as well as the sentientist one, there are some conflicts with political action, political thought. I guess this has always been the case if you're thinking on a humanistic level, because I suppose animals can't act politically, can they themselves? So,
well, they can't. But it's interesting. There's one of the books that's in the references on the final slide. It's called Sentientist Politics by a chap called Alistair Cochrane,
right.
and he's done some very advanced thinking about how you might actually bring non-human animals into the political realm. Now, they can't vote directly, but there are ideas about having representatives for non-human animals in our democracy. There are different forms of at least having their wishes represented, because I think we can make a pretty good guess at some of the basics of what their interests might be. So, you say that it's not obvious, and it's at a much earlier stage, but ultimately, I think a political system which at least acknowledges the moral salience of other beings beyond humans might be interesting too.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing, which I think is, I'd love to see some stats on this, but I'd imagine it's similar with humanism and sentientism, is that we tend to span across the political spectrum as well. I think it's hard to be socially conservative as a humanist or a sentientist because of that universal compassion for anything sentient or anything human. So it's hard to want to restrict other people's rights or to restrict their liberties for a social or traditional reason, because we're committed to evidence and reason, and we have a universal compassion. So that's one area where, I could be wrong, but I don't think there are many deeply socially conservative humanists or sentientists. But when you look at other aspects of politics, you look about different forms of political organization. I know sentientists who are social democrats and communists and anarchists and libertarians. They're they're across the spectrum, and the same are on an economic basis as well. Because while they might all share that commitment to evidence and reason, and they have very different views about how to express universal compassion and how to do the right thing for everybody. Right. So, some people on the right think a market economy is the best way for everybody and everything to flourish, and some others think a stronger state is, right? So there's an enormous diversity of political views about how to achieve that, despite the simple shared baseline. And in a way, that's part of the intent. The intent is not to solve all of human and animal problems. It's just to try and say, let's be unashamed about having a universal baseline that is very hard to challenge, and that ultimately, could everyone come to agree with this, right? And I'm very nervous about universalism because it can feel like it rides roughshod over different cultures or traditions or different ways of doing things. I don't want to, I don't think it makes sense for us to have a very detailed philosophy that you force on people at all. But if you have a philosophy that is so basic that all it commits to is a use of evidence and reason, that it's naturalistic and it has universal compassion for anything capable of suffering, that to me feels like it's a baseline that's set at such a low simplistic level that it might actually be a healthy sort of universalism that we could all use as a grounding. And we still have so much else to fight about after that. But like humanism, it's a foundation. It doesn't purport to solve all of our problems.
Perhaps it's a progressive, or not a progressive, a progression as well. It's not an end point. It's not a Marxism, or in that way, there isn't an end point to this.
I agree, and that partly comes from the naturalistic stance, right? Because some people will challenge the naturalistic stance from outside because they will say, "Well, you don't have all the answers. You can't be perfect." And we're not trying to be perfect, right? We never think we can be. With a scientific worldview, our beliefs are provisional. They're probabilistic.
Yes.
They're always open-minded, always open to new evidence. We're just trying to get less wrong over time. So yeah, it's highly likely to be a never-ending progression of just
Yes.
trying to do better, right? Yeah.
I think there's been a debate always, or it comes up in humanism, and I'm sure it does in sentientism as well. Firstly, thinking of it in purely political terms, there will be some humanists who believe there should be a humanist political party, for example.
Yeah.
In terms of action and how you get to enact these ideas in the wider society. It's generally, I think that's a minority, because I think generally there's a realization that these things are, as you say, they're an underpinning, a foundation, a superstructure or something of moral concern, aren't they, in the world, rather than a program of action, which would be like a political program or something like that. And there may be lots of variation, as you say, in the politics of members. I mean, there are certainly conservative humanists. We have them on, the all parliamentary party committee in Parliament is Crispin Glover, Crispin Blunt, isn't it?
I think so.
He's a conservative, yeah. The other thing I was going to ask, I'm wondering if there's an instinct to this. Being, if you're a naturalist, you might believe that evolution plays an enormous part in our thinking as well, even if from a very distant or indirect way, but a sense of sympathy for animals I'm trying to get at, or for life, because, for example, I've seen Janes ushering out a little ant from their temple with a piece of paper. All of them will stop, and they will go down on the ground, and they will wait, however long it takes to get this ant out of the room, so that they're not going to be treading on it, so that they can then shut the door and get on with whatever their flame business is that they're doing. I'm wondering if there's a connection to life in a very broad sense that we have, that we can tap into. It's a moral instinct, perhaps.
I think there is, and I think it's, people with a religious mindset sometimes get that sense of connection because we're all part of God's creation, right? So they might feel that empathy or that sense of connection with other life for those supernatural reasons. Sadly, often that's then undermined by thinking, and God gave us dominion over it, so we can do what the hell we like, right? Whereas I think the naturalistic position gets to a similar place, and that because we are evolved animals, we're not the tip of some evolutionary tree. All of the other animals that exist today are also the tip of the evolutionary tree as well. And we have enormous commonality, historically and anatomically and biologically and behaviorally. And, the more we learn about animals, the more similar to us they seem. I can't think of a single piece of research that's been done in the last couple of decades that said, oh no, animals are more stupid and less emotionally intelligent and less capable than we thought. Everything we find out, they seem to, the behavior and their capability to experience seems to be richer and richer. So I think you're right. I think there's a much better grounded sense of communal connection, if you like, with the wider living world, and certainly with the wider sentient world, that comes from a naturalistic stance than anything founded on supernatural or religious beliefs.
I think it is sometimes remarkable how culture can interfere with that, if there is such a thing as that instinct, where that I saw some horrific pictures of a Chinese kitchen, for example, which I'm afraid I can't forget once I've seen it. But that would be a cultural overriding of an instinct, possibly.
And this is, I think, something that Sentientism and Humanism shares, in that because we're committed to evidence and reason, and because we have a universal sense of compassion, we're supposed to be really good at spotting where tradition or culture or supernatural belief has led us astray and led us to think that something's acceptable morally that really just isn't, based on the facts, right? So, and that's partly my frustration sometimes when talking to even some of the, current and past leaders of, humanist organizations, who I see as, real leaders in their field, right? These are deeply intellectual, important moral thinkers. But when you start to discuss animal ethics with them, sometimes it feels like the subject is kryptonite, right? They can't engage with it with integrity anymore. So I won't name him, but someone who I see, I really look up to and respect and admire, and has been a key part of the humanist movement for many years. And I had a conversation with him about sentientism via email, and he essentially agreed with everything we were talking about, but closed out the conversation by saying, "But bacon." Right now I can understand that from just a random person I bump into on the street, but someone who is genuinely a deep moral thinker and a moral leader, I find it difficult. But at the same time, I've got to be careful here, because that's exactly the way I thought for most of my life, right? So I absolutely understand how deep these societal norms and these traditions and these patterns of behavior and the nervousness about not wanting to be seen as weird, I understand how deep they go, and it's very hard to throw it off. But that's, in a way, that's what humanists are supposed to be about. We don't think FGM is fine because it's their culture. We go, it's clearly, obviously, sickeningly immoral and awful, so we want to stop it. And you can add the list, right? The list that was on the slide earlier on.
Yes.
While humanism and sentientism, in a sense, might not feel like it's got a political agenda when we're thinking about the NHS or the economy, it absolutely has an agenda about resisting very clearly obvious moral harms that have no justification except for societal norms and tradition and religion. So, yeah, I agree. I think it's, but it's hard to carry it through, right? We all have our own cognitive dissonances. We all have our own acrasias, and we're all a work in progress. But hopefully, this is, this is, as you say, another progressive step.
Are we not perfect yet?
I don't think we ever will be. It doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying, but we will never be perfect.
Yeah. Striving, yes. Yeah. If that doesn't sound too religious. Anybody else? We've lost a few, I think, but
yeah, we had a couple of chat comments. I think that was just Philip saying goodbye.
Right. Oh yes, okay. Yes, Tony.
I did think that approaches reading about this talk beforehand that there'd be some disparity with what I think and what the speaker's views were, but in actual fact, he's merely confirmed that what I believed was an aspect of my humanism has actually been quantified by this word sentientism. I didn't know the word in the way that it's used today, in the way that it is. That was anything that I could resonate with, but very much so. It's very much the way I think. And I've assumed, without, I suppose, thinking about it, that all other humanists think the same way as me. As Jamie says, clearly not. So I'm not sure what we do about that. Whether we want to catch up with us, assuming that we think we're ahead. But at least we're there, and I'm intrigued and impressed. I shall hopefully get one of these books that's been listed and have a good read. Yes. Just to confirm that that everything's been talked about today is very much what I believe myself. So, which is one of the reasons I haven't really asked any questions.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. Thanks, Tony. And yeah, I mean, I've written some articles and there's some podcast interviews and various other things on the website as well that might be interesting. And you'd be very welcome in any of the groups. But I'd extend that to anybody. Like I say, it's just for people who are interested in talking about it, not people who necessarily are a sentientist.
Certainly, if you look at your Facebook page.
Yeah, great. But I'd say the response I have from humanists, and I still count myself as a humanist, is many people feel that way, Tony. So many people say the same thing. They say, well, this is the way I've always thought, but it's useful to have this concept of sentience being what matters morally, not just the human species. So many sentientists just go, yeah, this is sort of obvious, and I've always thought this way. There are a few, not many, but there are a few who explicitly say, no, I want my humanism to just be about the human species, right? And I don't want us to have any broader moral consideration. They don't necessarily think causing harm or death to animals is a good thing, right? But they explicitly want humanism to be focused on humans and humans only. there don't seem to be many of those, but there are some. I think most are just in the middle ground, where they say, look, I get what you're saying, and I sort of agree, but it's still too difficult for me to come on board because you know, the social norms I'm part of, and the culture I'm part of, and the family I'm part of, and you know, and animal farming just feels too normal, and it's just a big, you know, some of the implications. You know, I agree with everything you're saying, but so I think most people are in that sort of bucket, as I was for decades. So
yeah,
I understand.
Okay, Jamie, I think we're winding down. Obviously, people are having to go to
yeah, of course,
other appointments and things. So thank you so much, and
Thank you.
I'll be posting around lots of information to everyone that's participated here today. I'm just wondering, do you think Sam Harris has heard of Jamie of Sentientism? Whether you could get on the Sam Harris podcast would be very interesting.
I would love to do that. I mean, his book, The Moral Landscape,
yes,
basically is Sentientism without using the term.
Right.
You know, he talks about having a moral circle that includes all sentient beings. Now, the frustration is that he personally hasn't been able to actually, you know, bring his behaviours in line with that philosophy, but it has much in common with it.
Yes.
And one of the videos on my site, I don't know if you've heard of Jay Shapiro, who directed and produced the video he did on Islam and the future of tolerance, the conversation he had with
Oh, right,
yes.
yes.
But there's a 3-hour video conversation I had with Jay Shapiro that's up on the website.
Right, okay.
But whether Sam's heard of it or not, I'm not sure. I'd love to get his feedback, and if
you could have a short 4-hour conversation with Sam.
Exactly. If we can appear on the podcast, maybe that's the next step.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie, very much.
I'll tell him I've been on Harrow Humanists, and I think
that'll get you in. That's a golden ticket.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much.
I'd love to hear any more feedback offline as well. So
yes, and in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a talk on Renaissance humanism. If you're interested in popping in to have a listen to that.
Brilliant. I will do. I look forward.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks
Goodbye.
a lot. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.